Before we get started, from now until May 22nd, I am running a giveaway for a free signed copy of The Littlest Elephant by Catherine Applegate. Follow the link in the description and subscribe there to enter. Must be within the United States to be eligible to win. And thank you for listening. Welcome to the Book Fair Podcast. My name is Anthony, and this show is all about children's literature and the freedom to read. This week, we have an interview with Randi Smith, author of Ada Holloway's Had Enough. Next week, we will have another episode covering new book releases, as well as another interview on Friday. Make sure to follow the podcast wherever you are currently listening to stay up to date on the latest news in children's literature. Now, let's begin with the interview. Hello, Randi. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. How about you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for being here today. Can you start us off just by introducing yourself and the work that we'll be discussing today?
Yeah, my name is Randi Smith. When I am not an author, I am a library assistant at my local library, and I have a Bachelor of Arts in Publishing from Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee. Highly recommend for anyone who's interested. But we are talking about my debut novel, Ada Holloway's Had Enough, which follows 18-year-old Ada, senior in high school. She has to write her final senior essay in order to graduate, and she decides to write about the town's founder. Unfortunately, the only book about it is under review for a book ban in her library. So Ada, along with her friend David, her cousin Molly, and the library staff, decide to start a book club so Ada can read the book and they can try and combat this book ban.
And can you talk a little bit more about can you talk a little bit about the review process that this book goes through?
So the book in question that is under review, it's called The Founder's Promise, and the reason it is pulled from library shelves is the notion that it is not appropriate for younger readers because it does involve the story of a formerly enslaved African American man who eventually escapes, goes on to fight for the Union Army, and eventually settles this small town called Freeport. As far as Ada is concerned, and I think this is a true experience for anyone who suddenly found a book under review for a book ban in their library, um, it's kind of a sudden process. There's not a lot of forewarning towards it. It is all of a sudden it's pulled from shelves, there's an announcement, and the theoretical review process is that in this instance, the kind of mayor and the council would read the book and decide if it was appropriate to stay in the library. Sometimes that differs, but generally that's actually how it goes for most libraries that undergo this process, especially smaller ones. There's some sort of overseeing committee that theoretically would read the book and then decide whether it is appropriate or not. In Ada's instance, that is what happens, and she is most surprised by how sudden it is with very little warning. And I also think that's very realistic in this topic.
And talking about how it's a sudden process, that it's just gone one day and suddenly there's a notice about it. Can you talk a little bit about writing for young readers? And I know that Ada is an 18-year-old, so when we're talking young readers, we're talking young adult. What it can feel
Mhm.
like writing that perspective of a character who has a sense of agency, but not so much confidence in their ability to affect change.
I think that is a very common experience for a lot of people. I know looking back, so much of myself at that age was put into Ada because, of course, I had opinions on things going on in my community in the world. Everyone does. But especially when you're 18, when, yes, you're an adult on paper, but you're still in high school, you're still living with your parents, it can be easy to feel like you're not an adult, that you're still just a kid going about your life. And it's hard to reconcile that and feel like you can make any meaningful change. And Ada certainly struggles with that, trying to become an active participant in her own life, but also how to go about that in a way that isn't aggressive because she's not an aggressive person. She's very nervous about the idea of starting a book club and quote unquote standing up for the mayor, this kind of faceless figure who is attacking her library. She cares, but she doesn't know how to express it in a way that doesn't come off aggressive. I think that's something a lot of us go through as we're trying to figure out who we are and how we want to present ourselves to the world, trying to find our way without stepping on toes, because that's not what identity is about. Identity is just about being yourself, saying what you believe, and it's a very interesting dynamic, but I hope Ada's journey, including all of her missteps, is a great guide for people in a similar circumstance of how to find yourself without overcomplicating, without getting in the way, without unnecessary conflict, I should say.
And you brought up Ada's missteps. I always think that it's very interesting to see flaws inside of a character. Can you talk a little bit about some of those missteps and some of those areas where Ada may be frustrated with herself?
I do like to joke that Ada as a character probably makes more mistakes than she actually makes correct choices off the bat. Ada is very interesting in that she has opinions, but she comes from a very opinionated family. And sometimes she finds it, most of the time, she finds it easier to keep her opinions to herself, just kind of avoiding conflict, saving face in a way. She doesn't really care enough to get into full length discussions like her family usually would. So when Ada decides she wants to be in this book club and read this banned book, she already knows her parents, especially her mother, would not agree with her about the book ban. And instead of having a discussion, trying to see another point of view, just clearing the air, being honest, she lies a lot. She sneaks out of the house a couple of times. She lies some more. She's just very dishonest. It actually doesn't really even occur to her to be honest. She's so sure her parents will be against her, she doesn't even try. And the great thing about this book is that eventually Ada learns that's not any way to live your life with the people you love. The conversations aren't necessarily easy, but they're not world ending, especially with something about book bans. It's not like she's gonna get kicked out of the house for reading a book, but in Ada's mind and in a lot of 18-year-olds' minds, yeah, that's kind of that's obviously the logical next step is you say you don't agree with the book ban and you're gone, you're out, that's it. Um, I like to joke that my parents, we even agree on the idea of book bans and that we don't like them, but I would have been afraid to voice that opinion at 18 just because, like, what if? What if it's a bigger deal than I realize? I think that's something a lot of people go through when they're just finding their voice and talking about themselves and what they believe in. And poor Ada goes through many of these instances, but what's great is that she can learn from it and she has moments of, yeah, I shouldn't have done that. Um, Poor Ada.
And you mentioned that that Ada comes from an opinionated family and that her parents are not on the same page as her. And so I want to know, when it comes to organizing a banned book club, what kind of support does Ada have from her family or from those close to her, if not her parents?
Mhm. So the fun thing about Ada is none of the events of this book would have happened if she didn't have a strong support network. So it's actually not Ada's idea to start the book club, even though the book club is started really for her. It is her best friend David's idea, actually. And that is one of the great things about their friendship, Ada and David, is that they really are great for each other. Ada and David especially is a very driving force in standing up for Ada when she is not comfortable standing up for herself. You see that a bit with star football player Beckett, who copies Ada's homework because he doesn't want to do it himself, and David will actually stand up for Ada on her behalf. And I think that's one of the reasons they work very well is they understand each other and they know what each other need. On top of that, though, Ada's cousin Molly comes and stays with them for a couple of months. That's a whole separate kind of plot point there, but Molly is a great foil to Ada in that she is very unafraid to say what she thinks and do what she thinks is right. And that dynamic is super interesting because sneaking out of the house, I'm not sure it would have happened as well as it did if Molly hadn't have been there to drive it. So that's very interesting just seeing that personal validation. And then, of course, there's several library workers who are there for Ada. Mr. Booker is the head librarian. He helps organize this. Mrs. Garcia, who is David's grandmother, she is also a driving force trying to help Ada. Um, their original intention is just to help Ada with her schoolwork. And then as it goes along, try and use this to combat the book ban to show that it isn't necessary. There's also Mr. Martin, who works at the library. They're all very supportive of Ada. And not only are they supportive in starting the book club, but they're also very aware that it's not something Ada is entirely comfortable with because she isn't sure how her family would take it. They're very supportive, and it was very fun to write that, to see a group of people and a friend group be so supportive of someone, to understand that just because they're afraid to act doesn't mean they necessarily don't believe in what they're acting for.
And one of the key people that you mentioned there that I want to kind of dig into is you said that the library workers were also instrumental in organizing and supporting the book club. And so I would like to know, what is your perspective as a library assistant about the role that public libraries have for people in the community and the resources that they offer, as it shows in
Mhm,
Ada Holloway's Had Enough, as well as in real life?
mhm. I'll start by saying that I love my job very much and I don't speak for my library in any way, shape, or form. Book bans can be a sensitive topic, so I'm just putting that out there. Everything I say is my own personal opinion. What I found interesting is, first of all, I did write the first draft of this book before I was even hired at my library. So the idea of a small library trying to band together with very limited resources to combat a book ban instigated by the mayor of their town, that's a very different experience from if we were dealing with that at my library because, we've got a bigger community, we have a separate board, it's like a whole issue. Um, but there's different ways of combating. I will say, I don't live in a state like Florida or Texas or Tennessee where you're seeing book bans in like a very much more capacity, but we do have instances, of books being moved from a young adult or children's section into an adult section for the content that's pictured. And it's a very scary thing as a library worker to witness because I think there's this idea that the librarians are to blame. The library is doing this when that's not necessarily the case. Like, the thing is libraries are kind of pushing books, that's really not how it works. You don't really see that as much in Ada Holloway, but in my personal experience, that has been kind of a negative kind of stereotype thrown at us, and so I always like to say, "We're just trying to help you find the books you want, there's no hidden agenda." And as far as books in a library that may or may not be agreed with, you can even see this in Ada Holloway's Had Enough. There's not enough money in the world for a library to have every book ever written. If a book is in a library, it is very much because the community wants it. We regularly get rid of materials that the community does not want. And as far as Ada Holloway's Had Enough is concerned, I think you can see that this is the one book in existence on Freeport's founder. And it can only be found in Freeport's library because, what other town would want an obscure book about a small town's founder? And it is needed there. And you can see that in the fact that they're challenging the book ban. This book needs to be in the library to tell the story of Freeport. And I hope that will resonate with people who are maybe on the fence about book bans. Of course, this is just one instance, but I hope it'll let people see librarians are simply trying to make information accessible for all. Libraries can offer great resources, whether it's books or movies. We're fortunate in having like technology training and a seed catalog. There's a lot of free resources that libraries offer that you will not get anywhere else. There's nowhere like a library where you don't even have to be a card holder. We're not gonna turn you away at the door. You can just come in and exist for a little bit without needing to spend money, and I think that is a very sacred place in a sense, and they need to be protected. So that's my little spiel about libraries and how great they are.
It's very much appreciated because I talk a lot about book bans. You said you don't live in a state like Florida or Texas. I'm in Texas, and I was even thinking about it. Kentucky's kind of quiet because I do cover book bans on this podcast, and Kentucky is not one of the ones that comes up as often. But when you said that there were
Mhm,
books that are being relocated, that is what the bulk of book challenges look like. Um,
mhm.
anyway, aside from that, you said that you wrote the first draft for this book before you even started working at the library. Can you talk a little bit about what that early draft was like, where you were personally, and kind of the development process of writing out the story?
So the very cool thing about Ada Holloway's Had Enough is that it started as a project in one of my college classes. My junior year of college, it was a 10-page short story that my senior year of college turned into the first 18,000 words of a manuscript. This was all for my publishing classes, and while I loved the story and one day wanted to finish it, it wasn't necessarily on my radar, especially that post-college job search situation was very much on my mind. And so when my previous advisor, she's the head of the publishing department at Belmont, she had started a literary agency, and after I graduated, she wanted to represent me. That's kind of how my journey as an author began. Um, I think it's very interesting that a lot of this book started out as not a very clear image of how it was going to end. I was a senior in college. I was writing this thing for the grade and to graduate, and so there are certain things I had in the beginning that I didn't really know how they were going to end. I just wrote it to get the word count down. And so as I had a lot of free time on my hands, because I wasn't hired at the library until later, more towards the fall, I really dedicated myself to trying to tie this novel together, trying to make it into something great and a story about libraries and about book bans and about this community. There was a lot of little changes that came along with that. But something that I'm super happy with is that after I was hired at the library, I had a really great staff, really great coworkers, and a manager who answered all of my questions. And so I hope people reading this book will see that I tried to throw in some terms and some setting stuff. If you can believe it, I had an entire novel about a book club and never once referenced, like, events libraries host, which is crazy because working at a library, we host events all the time. Um, I really hope the library itself comes alive, which is great because it's where we spend the majority of this book. But I also like to mention that post-college job search time, I did feel very lost and very unsure of what I wanted to do with my life, other than I was like, "Hey, I'm working on this novel, so that's something." I think you can see a lot of that in Ada's journey, especially because she is a senior in high school. She is very concerned about what she's going to do in college and if she's going to enjoy it and if she should even go in general. That's a whole thing for a lot of seniors kind of grapple with. And even though, she was in high school, I was in college, I think you can see a lot of that worry and a lot of that fear. And it ties up really nicely that by the end of the book, she figures out what she wants to do. And after college, I did eventually figure out what I wanted to do. I enjoy working at the library a lot. So it's a fun little thing that happened.
And Randy, one of the things I wanted to ask about was you said that you have a bachelor's in arts in publishing. And I think that that's an awesome resource that a lot of people may not be familiar with. Can you talk a little bit about some of the work that you were able to do in that specific study that maybe some people in, more general English or writing classes may not have access to, that in case they want to look into these kinds of programs?
Yes, I would highly recommend anyone who's interested in the book industry look into a publishing program. The one at Belmont is the only one in the region, really. There's a couple in New York, obviously, but that was what made Belmont super accessible to me was that it was in Tennessee. I was fortunate to go through the editorial track. There was also a marketing and PR track. So no matter which side you were on, you were dedicated book publishing. I had a really, really great experience. I got to work for magazines and a romance publisher, and I got to be on the editorial staff of a literary magazine. And it was a super cool experience, not just because I was learning about the book industry and editing and all of that great stuff. There was a lot going on that English majors would be familiar with as far as like story structure and word choice and wordplay and grammar and all of that. But it was super fascinating to be able to see the life cycle of a book. Even just as a reader, I found it fascinating what goes into getting a book from an author's mind onto a computer and into the hands of readers. In my mind, it was a much simpler process than what I found out going into Belmont. It's a multi-year process with so many different little quirks that have to happen to make it work. Multiple people look at these books, and it was just a fascinating journey into the life cycle of what it really takes to get a book like this out into the world, even just going from little things to grammar to the cover design itself and the amount of people involved. I absolutely loved it. I focused mostly on editing, and even that was different. I thought grammar, I've got that down, but really going into word choice and the structure of a story, that is a fascinating puzzle to put together. There was one exercise we did where we wrote out a story and then we cut it into sections and tried to rearrange it like out of chronological order to see if that made it better. Being able to look at a story not just as this like linear timeline, but what happens if you play around with that and try to mess it up, quote unquote, to make something better. It's just a fascinating way to look at stories. And if anyone is interested in the book industry at all, even if it's not the editorial side, even if it is that marketing and PR side and author relations and reaching out to podcast hosts and all of that, it's a very fascinating program, and I highly recommend it for anyone who is interested.
And now, having your debut novel being published, it must be a wonderful milestone, and you get to look at yourself as not just an aspiring writer, but a published writer. And this makes me very excited because I like to ask this question to all guests on the podcast, and being able to ask a person whose debut work is just being released. Randy, how do you see yourself and the work that you do as a writer?
Another fun fact about me is that when I went into Belmont and a publishing major, I had dabbled with writing in the past, but I didn't see myself as an author. I loved books, but I saw myself in more of that behind the scenes role of helping other authors craft their stories, make it the best that it can be, and then getting it into the hands of readers. And to suddenly find myself as an author, not just as a debut indie author, but also as like this book means a lot to me. And I hope, of course, it means a lot to other people. But even if it doesn't, I hope to make book banning a conversation. I hope to bring it back into the forefront because I think, you know, 2023 was kind of a high point for following the news about this. That's when I even first learned book banning was happening in the United States, which is crazy to think about. But I do think it's kind of become old news in a sense. And I would like to reignite that conversation, especially geared towards young adults and teenagers who are the most impacted by these book bans, by these censorship attempts. And I hope even just starting that conversation again, kind of turning the camera, focusing in a bit more, that is my ultimate goal with this book. And I found a lot of joy in trying to start that conversation, in talking with people about book banning and even opening their eyes to it because I know a lot of the younger adults I've talked to have been like I was and not really understood book banning and that it affected them so much. And I like the idea of starting those conversations. If I write more books, which I am, but, when they eventually get released, I hope to have a similar impact in everything I write, to be intentional, to start conversations that maybe are being discussed, but not with the teens and young adults who are being impacted. I can't say for sure where that's going to go, but that is my intention. That is my wish to just be a conversation starter, especially geared towards young adults who I do think find themselves somehow adults, but also kids. And it's a very weird time to be alive.
Thank you. That was an interview with Randi Smith. Her debut novel, Ada Holloway's Had Enough, is available now. You can learn more about Randi and her work at randysmithwrites.com. If you appreciate the work being done on this show, there are a number of ways to show your support. First, you can like, comment, or follow wherever you are currently listening to help push the show out to new listeners. Second, you can follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky at BookFairPod. Lastly, you can follow the show on Patreon at patreon.com/thebookfair. Following is free, and there are no posts hidden behind a paywall. Of course, the best way to help the Book Fair podcast grow is simply to share it with a friend, an educator, or a young reader in your life. Thank you so very much for listening, and as always, I'll talk at you next time.